My wife humiliated me in front of 40 people at my father's funeral. But she had no idea my father already knew exactly who she was, and he'd left one single line in his will that destroyed her before she even understood what hit her. My name is Honey Fobbs. I'm 41 years old, a structural engineer living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and until the morning of my father's funeral, I believed I understood the shape of my own life. I design buildings for a living. I calculate loads, stresses, the exact point where a beam gives way under pressure it was never meant to hold. I never thought to apply that same scrutiny to my marriage. My wife Marla and I had been together 12 years, married for 9 of them, and I'd spent most of that time assuming stillness meant stability. My father, Walt, never agreed with that kind of thinking. He built his construction supply business from a single rented garage in the 1980s, and he never forgave me for walking away from it to sit behind a desk instead. We hadn't spoken about that disagreement in years, but standing at the podium of the funeral home in Squirrel Hill, rain ticking steadily against the windows, I felt it anyway, a weight I couldn't name, pressing down somewhere between my ribs. I was 3 sentences into the eulogy, my voice already unsteady, when I heard it, the buzz of a phone against the wooden pew, sharp enough to cut through the room. I didn't need to look to know it was Marla's. She glanced down at the screen, and something crossed her face. Not concern, not embarrassment. Something closer to anticipation. She rose without a word and slipped out the side door, her heels clicking against the tile long after she'd disappeared from view. I kept talking. I don't remember what I said. My eyes kept drifting toward the door, toward the empty space where my wife should have been sitting, listening, grieving beside me. In the front row, my father's casket sat closed, draped in white lilies he would have hated. He always said flowers were for people who didn't know what else to bring. I didn't know it yet, but somewhere in that phone call, in that name flashing across her screen, the first thread of everything I thought I knew had already started to come loose. Marla came back into the reception hall 20 minutes later, and by then most of the mourners had already moved into the adjoining room, balancing paper plates of food they weren't eating. I was standing near my father's old business partner, Gerald, half listening to a story about a job site in Erie from decades ago, when I heard her voice rise above the low hum of conversation. She wasn't just loud. She was aimed. "You're just like him," she said, loud enough that the room actually went quiet. "Always chasing the numbers, never the people. You couldn't even give your own father a real goodbye without checking your watch." I hadn't checked my watch. I don't think I'd looked at it once. But that didn't matter. The accusation landed exactly where she wanted it to, in front of my aunts, my cousins, men my father had worked construction jobs with for 30 years. I felt my face go hot. Somewhere behind me, someone set down a plastic fork, and the small clatter of it against a paper plate felt louder than anything else in the room. What none of them knew, what I barely let myself think about, was that Marla's words echoed something my father himself used to say, back when I first told him I was leaving the business for engineering school. He'd stood in the doorway of the garage that used to be his whole world, arms crossed, and told me I was choosing blueprints over people, comfort over legacy. I never told Marla that story. I never told anyone. But somehow, standing in that fluorescent-lit reception hall, she'd found the exact wound my father left in me 9 years ago and pressed her thumb into it, like she'd known where to look all along. I didn't answer her. I just stood there, the overhead lights humming faintly, feeling 40 pairs of eyes shift between us. My uncle cleared his throat. Someone's chair scraped against the floor. And for one long suspended moment, I understood that whatever had just happened wasn't really about my father at all. It was about something Marla had been carrying, waiting for the right moment, or the right audience, to set down. The rest of the reception passed in a kind of fog. People offered condolences I barely registered, hands on my shoulder, murmured words about my father being a good man, and gone too soon. I nodded through all of it, still replaying Marla's outburst, still trying to understand where it had come from. It was nearly 4 o'clock, the crowd thinning, when I noticed a man near the back of the hall I didn't recognize. Mid-50s, gray suit pressed sharp enough to look out of place among the mourners' dark, wrinkled funeral clothes. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was watching the room the way you watch something you're waiting to finish. He approached the funeral home director, said a few quiet words, and handed over a plain white envelope. I only caught it because the director glanced my way afterward, like he was confirming something. A few minutes later, he crossed the room and placed the envelope in my hands directly. "For H. Fobbs," he said. "Private." Then he turned and walked out without waiting for a response, the gray suit disappearing through the double doors into the rain. I didn't even get a chance to look at the handwriting. Marla appeared beside me almost instantly, her hand closing over the envelope before mine had fully processed what I was holding. "I'll hold on to that," she said, already tucking it into her coat pocket. "You've got enough to deal with today." I should have said something. I should have asked why a stranger delivering an unmarked envelope at my father's funeral was something she felt entitled to intercept. But grief has a way of dulling your instincts right when you need them most, and I let it go, telling myself I'd ask her about it later, once the funeral home had emptied out and the day had stopped feeling like it was happening to someone else. I didn't know then that the envelope contained the first thread of a truth my father had spent his final months quietly assembling, a truth he'd trusted a lawyer to deliver, and a truth Marla apparently already suspected was coming. That night, the house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound, the refrigerator humming, the pipes ticking as they cooled. Marla had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion, and I told myself I believed her. I sat in the dark kitchen for almost an hour before I gave in to the thing I'd been circling since the funeral home. I wanted that envelope. I found her coat draped over the closet doorknob and slid my hand into the pocket. The envelope was there, but it wasn't sealed the way it had been when the stranger handed it to me. It had been opened, then carefully resealed with a thin strip of clear tape along the edge. The kind of detail you'd only notice if you were looking for it, and I was. Inside was a single business card, Priscilla Cole, estate and trust attorney, with an address downtown I didn't recognize. Nothing else. No note. No explanation. Just a name I'd never heard my father mention, attached to a legal specialty that made my stomach tighten before I even understood why. I stood there in the dim kitchen light, turning the card over in my hands, and a memory surfaced I hadn't thought about in months. My father, sitting across from me at his kitchen table back in the spring, saying, almost offhandedly, "I've been handling some things. Making sure everything's in order, in case." I remembered brushing it off at the time, assuming he meant the business, maybe some paperwork with Gerald. I hadn't asked what everything meant. I hadn't asked what he was preparing for, or who he didn't trust enough to leave things unprotected. I walked back toward the bedroom and stood in the doorway, watching Marla sleep, her face calm in a way that suddenly felt less like peace and more like practice. The phone flashlight in my hand cast long shadows across the wall, and for the first time in 12 years of marriage, I found myself studying my own wife like she was a stranger, like she was someone I needed to figure out before I could trust her again. I confronted her the next morning, the business card sitting between us on the kitchen table like evidence I hadn't decided how to use yet. "Why did you open this?" I asked, keeping my voice level, though nothing about how I felt was level. "Why do you know a name I've never heard before?" Marla barely looked at the card. "You're being paranoid," she said, pouring coffee she didn't seem interested in drinking. "We buried your father yesterday, and you want to interrogate me about a business card? Some respect would be nice, honey." It was a good deflection. It almost worked. But something about the practiced calm in her voice made it worse, not better. Like she'd rehearsed the response before I'd even asked the question. I thought about our wedding day, 9 years earlier, a memory I hadn't revisited in a long time. My father had given a toast that made half the room laugh nervously, the kind of joke that wasn't really a joke. "Watch how she treats people when she thinks no one's counting," he'd said, raising his glass toward Marla with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'd laughed it off then, chalked it up to a father's protective instinct. Standing in my kitchen now, coffee going cold between us, I finally understood he might have meant it literally. "I'm not interrogating you," I said. "I'm asking a simple question." She didn't answer. Instead, her phone buzzed against the counter, screen lighting up with the same unfamiliar name I'd seen flash across it at the funeral home. No last name, just 3 letters saved in her contacts like an inside joke I wasn't part of. She reached over and turned the phone face down without breaking eye contact with me, like the gesture alone should have been enough to end the conversation. It wasn't. If anything, it confirmed something I hadn't wanted to admit out loud yet, that the woman I'd spent 12 years building a life with was keeping pieces of herself locked away from me, carefully, deliberately, in rooms I wasn't allowed to enter. And my father, in his last months, had apparently found a way inside one of those rooms before I ever thought to look. Priscilla Cole's office called 3 days later, requesting we come in for a formal reading of my father's will. I expected a quiet, uncomfortable hour, the kind of legal formality families endure before dividing up what's left of a life. Marla insisted on coming, which surprised me. She hadn't shown much interest in my father while he was alive, but she dressed sharply that morning, more sharply than the occasion called for, and there was a steadiness in her that I hadn't seen since before the funeral. Almost confidence. I didn't understand it yet, but I noticed it. The office was small, wood-paneled, smelling faintly of old paper and coffee. Priscilla Cole turned out to be exactly the kind of person my father would have trusted. Direct, unhurried, unreadable in the way people who've spent decades handling other people's secrets tend to be. As she pulled the will from a folder, I remembered something I hadn't thought about in months. A visit my father made to our house nearly 8 months earlier, unannounced, staying only 20 minutes before leaving abruptly. At the time I'd assumed it was nothing, some errand or passing thought. Marla had seemed unusually quiet for days afterward, and I'd chalked it up to grief over his declining health. I never asked what they'd discussed. I never thought to. Sitting across the desk now, watching Marla's fingers tap an uneven rhythm against her knee, I found myself wondering, for the first time, whether that visit had been about something else entirely, whether my father had seen something during those 20 minutes that changed the way he looked at her. Priscilla cleared her throat and began reading, her voice steady, official, moving through the standard language of assets and beneficiaries. Marla sat straighter, her composure almost theatrical, like she already knew what was coming and had decided to meet it with dignity rather than surprise. I didn't share her certainty. I sat there with my hands pressed flat against my knees, bracing for something I couldn't yet name, while the wall clock behind Priscilla's desk ticked steadily through the silence, counting down toward whatever my father had left buried in his final wishes. Priscilla read through the estate methodically. The house, the business, a modest investment account my father had built over decades of careful, unglamorous saving. Most of it came to me, which didn't surprise me, given I was his only child. What surprised me was the shift in her voice as she reached the final paragraph, a subtle change in pacing, like she'd read this particular line before and knew exactly what it would do to the room. "I leave nothing to my daughter-in-law, Marla," she read, "as she is aware of why." The office went silent in a way I'd never experienced before. Not the hush of respect, but the specific silence of something breaking. I turned to look at Marla, and for the first time in 12 years, I watched her composure collapse in real time. The color left her face first, then the practiced stillness in her hands, replaced by a tightness in her jaw that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. She didn't ask what the line meant. She didn't demand clarification, the way an innocent person might. She just sat there, staring at the desk, as though she'd been waiting for this exact sentence to arrive and had run out of road to outrun it. I felt something shift inside my own chest, a mixture of confusion and dawning suspicion I didn't yet have the full shape of. My father had known something. Not suspected. Known, with enough certainty to write it into a legal document that would outlive him. And whatever it was, Marla understood it completely, without a single word of explanation from Priscilla or from me. The wall clock ticked on behind us, indifferent to the wreckage settling over the room. I thought about the business card I'd found in her coat pocket, the phone she'd turned face down on the counter, the 20-minute visit my father made to our house 8 months earlier that no one had ever explained. Pieces I hadn't known were connected suddenly felt like they were arranging themselves into a shape I wasn't ready to see. Whatever my father had discovered, he'd trusted a single line, delivered by a stranger in a wood-paneled office, to finally bring it into the light. Priscilla asked to speak with me privately once Marla had gone to wait in the hallway. her heels clicking away with none of the confidence they'd carried in that morning. Once the door clicked shut, Priscilla reached into her folder and handed me a sealed envelope, my name written across it in my father's unmistakable handwriting, the same uneven capital letters he'd used on invoices and job estimates for 30 years. I opened it in the car, alone, rain streaking down the windshield in slow, uneven lines. My father's letter was short, but it read like something he'd rewritten a dozen times before settling on the version he wanted me to see. He explained that 18 months earlier, he'd noticed something during a visit to our house. Inconsistencies in the way Marla talked about our finances, small contradictions that didn't add up. Rather than confront her directly, or worry me without proof, he'd hired a private investigator, a decision he admitted felt uncomfortable even as he made it. What the investigator found was worse than he'd expected. Marla had been quietly transferring money from our joint accounts into a separate account registered under her maiden name, small enough amounts each time to avoid drawing my attention, patient enough to suggest she'd been planning this for longer than months. My father's letter connected it to something else, a real estate transaction in Charlotte, North Carolina, a condo she'd been in the process of closing on, financed almost entirely by money that had once belonged to both of us. The unfamiliar name on her phone wasn't another man, not in the way I'd feared. It was her real estate agent, coordinating a life she'd been building for herself in another city, another state, far enough away that she could disappear from our marriage cleanly, financially secure, before my father's death and the complications of his estate could interfere with her timeline. I sat in that car for a long time after finishing the letter, watching rain blur the world outside the windshield into something formless. My father hadn't just protected his own legacy with that one line in his will. He'd handed me the truth about my marriage in the only way he knew how. Carefully, deliberately, and just in time. I found Marla sitting on the living room floor when I got home, her back against the couch, knees pulled to her chest like she already knew what I was carrying. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw the letter at her or demand answers the way television versions of this moment always seemed to unfold. I simply sat down across from her and told her what my father's letter said, watching her face for the exact moment denial gave way to something closer to relief. It came faster than I expected. "It wasn't about another man," she said quietly, staring at a point somewhere past my shoulder. "I need you to understand that much." She told me about the condo in Charlotte, the maiden name account, the slow, careful transfers she'd made over nearly 2 years. Not out of malice, she insisted, but out of a need to have something that was only hers before she let herself leave. She talked about feeling erased, a word she used more than once, describing years of watching me orient every decision around my father's approval, even after I'd supposedly walked away from his business and his expectations. She said she'd resented him for a long time, resented the space he still occupied in our marriage, even when he wasn't in the room, and that somewhere along the way, that resentment had curdled into something she couldn't undo. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. I don't think she expected it. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling less rage than I'd anticipated, and more a kind of quiet, exhausted clarity, the sensation of a structure finally revealing exactly where its weight had been failing all along. "I need the account numbers," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "Everything. Tonight." She didn't argue. She reached for her phone without another word, and in that small, silent surrender, I understood something my father must have known months before I did, that some marriages don't end in a single dramatic collapse. Sometimes they end quietly, on a living room floor, with two people finally telling each other the truth too late for it to save anything. 6 months have passed since that night on the living room floor. I sold the house we'd shared for 9 years, along with most of what filled it, and moved into a smaller place near the Allegheny River, close enough that I can hear the water some evenings when the traffic dies down. I kept my father's business, the one I'd once walked away from without fully understanding what I was walking toward instead. Gerald still runs the daily operations, but I've started showing up more, learning the parts of it I'd spent 9 years avoiding, and finding, unexpectedly, that I don't resent it the way I thought I would. Marla and I finalized the divorce quietly, the account transfers documented clearly enough that there wasn't much left to argue over. She moved to Charlotte, into the condo my father's investigator had uncovered months earlier, and I haven't spoken to her since the paperwork was signed. I think about her less than I expected to, though there are still evenings when I catch myself replaying that line from the will, wondering how long my father carried that knowledge alone, protecting me from a truth he wasn't ready to hand me until he absolutely had to. I understand him better now than I did while he was alive. I understand the 20-minute visit, the private investigator, the careful, uncomfortable decision to let a lawyer deliver the truth instead of saying it himself. Grief, it turns out, revealed more about my marriage in a single afternoon than 12 years of living inside it ever did. I was sitting on the riverbank 2 days ago, the late afternoon light turning gold across the water, when my phone rang. Priscilla Cole's name lit up the screen, and something in my chest tightened before she even said a word. "There's a second letter," she told me. "Your father left instructions for it to be opened only if you ever remarried." I sat there for a long moment after she hung up, watching the river move steadily past, wondering what else my father had quietly prepared for a future he wouldn't live to see, and whether I was ready to find out. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories.